Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 24 of this Valorant Life. In this episode, Adam and I are discussing my weird theory of Valorant, which is I think this one thing explains almost everything in Valorant. And so that's a big claim. And I'm just going to start off with kind of why I got here, which is my background is something that I've always been into is sports analytics. And so um one thing they try to figure out in sports analytics is like what's predictive, like what's going to help us predict whether a team is good or not. And you would think it would be something like, oh, if you've got a lot of wins in the first half of the season, that should predict the second half of the season. In hockey, as an example, which is a game with some randomness in it, Valorant being one of those games too, we find that isn't true. We actually find that there are much more predictive measures than wins. So in hockey, they find that the team that generates more shots against or shots for on the other team versus shots against, if a team can do that durably over a, let's say, 40 game span, 30 game span, that actually predicts their wins in the second half of the season much more strongly than the wins themselves. In American football, they find a similar type of metric, which is wins in football are still fairly random. They only play 16 games, but especially because sometimes the win threshold is so narrow, they find that wins is not as predictive as wins that a team had where they won by more than 7 points. If they just look at teams that won by more than 7 points, that's a way more predictive measure of how they're going to do in the future than just their wins, because a lot of wins can kind of be coin flips. And in football, they tend to be, when they're really close, they tend to find that, and I'm really simplifying here, but they tend to find that most wins in American football are related more to who won the turnovers. Like if you fumbled, did you recover or did the other team recover? And so that's a big driving factor. So that's kind of my theory. That's kind of the background theory to what I'm bringing to thinking about Valorant. And so I don't know if I want to call this unified Valorant theory or I want to call it gunfight theory. I feel like gunfight theory feels a little less uh kind of like crazy villain. So let's call it gunfight theory. Um so my idea is that I think gunfight percentage is the thing that is really the predictive thing for how you win and lose games. And actually improving your gunfight percentage, I think, is the one factor at a high level that is actually going to drive your ranked improvement. And I'll break it down. So we're going to have a graphic for this, which is, so I think gunfight percentage is generally going to be around 50%. And that's including, I think there's gunfight percentage for you, and then there's gunfight percentage for your teammates. I think if you are at the correct rank, it'll be around 50% for you and your teammates. The big thing there is pointing out that your ability to affect your own gunfight percentage is way higher than your ability to affect your teammates. And then there's all these other factors, I think, that support your gunfight percentage. And I think this is where I think Adam and I are excited about this, because I think it gives some flexibility for understanding what it looks like to be a Valorant player and playing to your own style. So I think there are gunfight factors, let's call them, that are completely within your control. And so these gunfight factors are physical, like are you sleeping enough? Are you getting a good enough rest? Are you hydrating and taking care of your body? Mental, which is, are you able to manage your own emotions and be at a good mental state through the game? I think there's aim, which is completely within your control. Like you can work on your aim and you can work on how well you can express your aim in the game. And then lastly, gunfight hygiene, which I think is mostly about discipline. Like, are you able to be disciplined enough not to just crouch spray when someone comes in front of you and it's a high pressure situation? So I think these things are all controllable and they're things that you can work on out of the game. Next is a category of factors which I think are more in game and they're only partially within your control, which is how you use your utility, uh, how you play time, your positioning in the round, your weapons, which is of course your econ in the game, is going to be affecting your gunfight percentage. And lastly, like how you use information. And I think that's tied to positioning. So I believe these are all partially within your control. And I think these are uh, really big items that affect your team's gunfight percentage. So this is my overall thinking, and I'm happy to be completely wrong. But I really like that this idea really encompasses that some players win through different methods. So with all of that, Adam, it's a long monologue. Where would you poke holes in this, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, the first thing I guess I would want to ask is like, um, with different like players' strengths and stuff. Like some people climb with like really good team play. Like maybe you would think of like a breach or a KO. They're like really focused on setting up their teammates, and then you have like the player that is super leveraged on their individual gun duels, like typically duelist players, jet players, arena players, where they don't really coordinate or comm as much, but they're really focused on themselves. I guess like how does that dynamic fit into this theory, and how would you kind of like come to terms with that?
So I'm thinking that a duelist player that really focuses on mechanics is mostly, and I think this is why it's maybe easier to climb as a duelist focusing on mechanics, is that I think that's in that mental aim gunfight hygiene category. And I think those categories are all within your control. And your ability to affect your own gunfight percentage is high. And therefore, if you improve that, you can climb rank faster than your ability as a really supportive player to improve the gunfight percentage of your teammates. Because I think like a really good controller, a really good initiator, especially a flash initiator, can really benefit their teammates. But ultimately, those things are kind of out of your hands. Like you can't control whether they're like doing their managing their mental. You can't control whether they're using gunfight hygiene, or that they're practicing their aim outside of the game or warming up properly.
So in a way, it sounds like as an individual, your biggest factor that you can change is how you perform with your own gunfights with those things that are in your control, and that affects the outcome of the match more than say if you were to try to coordinate with your teammates. So maybe like if I were to throw random numbers on it, let's say like on a scale of like what I can control and how much impact it has on a game, it goes from like 1 to 10,
Mm-hmm.
and 10 being like high impact on
Yeah.
the course of a game.
Yeah.
And with the teammate stuff, like maybe I can only go from 1 to 5. So if I can maximize my individual capabilities, I'm able to impact the game more than, if I maximize my teammates' capabilities, it only goes up to a 5.
I think the one area I would point out where I think it is actually, because we were actually talking about this in your office hours this earlier this week, of like team wide mental.
Right.
So I think there's your own mental, and I think there's that's like you're probably taking on average 20% of the gunfights, 1/5, right? And everyone else is taking 80%. And maybe that's a little higher if you're a duelist, but let's just use those round numbers. I think if you are actually able to keep up the team wide mental, then you won't be able to affect their gunfight percentage that much, but you do get to affect it over 4 players. So I think there are some things here where the distributed effect is large, because you do get to do it over 4 players. But I think fundamentally, all this kind of points back to that you're the only real constant in all of your games. And so
Right.
your ability to improve and improve your gunfight percentage, whether that's mechanical, on the out of game stuff, the physical, mental gunfight hygiene, or the in game stuff, I think trying to affect your own gunfight percentage is probably going to be the most satisfying and fastest way to climb.
And I just wanted to add on to this. I think, like in my own experience with working with clients, this is true. People that tend to be a little bit more self-sufficient, or they kind of like, I don't know, play for themselves. Like maybe they don't come as much. Typically, you see this in like younger people. They don't have like good ways of, I guess, communicating socially. So they're really individual based, and they tend to be slightly higher rank. Like they reach their plateau at a slightly higher rank than say someone that's more of like a vibe merchant, as you would call it. So I do think it makes sense in practice as well, which is kind of, I guess, unsatisfying for those that want to play the game at a team level. But it is what it is, and it kind of speaks to the volume that Valorant is a shooter, like attack FPS game, and you need to have that first. Like the shooting realistically comes first before you can implement the tactics. So the other question I'll have for the gunfight percentage is, if we're trying to increase the amount of times we convert, what's to say, like, what if we just run away from all of our duels, right? Like if I'm an initiator player and I take 0 fights, or I should say I take 1 fight and I win that 1 fight, my gunfight percentage is 100%.
Yes.
So like, how does the amount of gunfights go into this whole gunfight percentage dynamic?
So I will look up the term later, but there's a rule in life that the things you observe, the things you measure, eventually become warped measures, right? So like in hockey, I told you how they found that players that are able to, on average, shoot more on the offensive goal than get shots against are better players. But if players know that and then they start taking crappy shots on the offensive goal to boost those stats, then the figure becomes much more nebulous, or it doesn't become that useful anymore. And I think same thing here. Like if you are playing for gunfight percentage and you're trying to keep it artificially high, then I think it's kind of missing the point. So yes, I think if you take that 1 fight and you don't take fight for the rest of the game and you're like 100% baby, like yes, your gunfight percentage is high, but effectively you're actually just saying, okay, then 99% of all the gunfights are all going to be in my team's hands. So basically, I'm going to try to game this number that I made up, and then, but basically put the game in my teammates' hands, which is a strategy. And I mean, some people do that, but I think we've talked about this in prior podcasts. If you're going to put your rank entirely in the hands of your teammates because you're going to play this purely supportive style, it's going to take way more games for any improvement in you to show up in your rank because you're going to just have way less effect.
Like my other question would be in the complete opposite end. Like what if I'm taking as many gun duels as possible to try to increase my influence over the game? Is that the way to go? And I kind of already have like a bias towards this, but I want to hear your thoughts and how does that fit into the dynamic?
So I think that's a nuanced question, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it too. I think on balance, that's probably a good way to go. You're going to have more effect on your games. You're going to stop playing scared and start playing to win instead of playing not to lose. So I think that's not a bad thing. I think the real question then is that aligned with both the type of role you're playing in the game? So obviously that would be more of a duelist role. And is it aligned with your playstyle? And of course, your playstyle can change. But I think if you can lean that way, I think that's good. I think regardless of almost role, it'd be good to lean that way. But I think the only way you can go full tilt that way, ideally, would be as a duelist because of your, especially as like a Jet or a Reyna, you have a get out of jail, or Yoru, you gotta kind of have a get out of jail free card. Whereas like an initiator Sentinel is not going to have that type of ability to make that kind of play and have that benefit on the game. But that's my thinking. What are you thinking?
I would agree with that. I think like my perspective as a player is that I want to have as many touch points as possible to influence the round. And in Valorant, that typically is in the form of gun duels. So I always try to advise clients, hey, you need to be looking for fights rather than hiding from fights, or rather than running from a fight using util. Maybe a good framework to think about this would be there's specific fights that, like, not all gunfights are equal, right? And this is where we need to be thinking about what are good fights. So maybe instead of looking for any gunfight, we need to be looking for a large amount of good gunfights. And that is kind of based on your role because, obviously as a duelist, you can fight off of barrier and you have tools to do that. Especially if you're on defense, you can go off angles, you can go wide, and you can effectively get an extra gun duel compared to, say, one of your teammates that isn't a duelist because they can't get away. Whereas, like, an initiator going for that is not good, but if they go for a different type of gun duel, then it can be good, and they can still look for more gun duels in that lens. So maybe, like, numbers-wise, you're looking for a gunfight that you think you have an advantage on, and you want to be milking as many of those as possible. to not, I guess, inflate the number, in which goes with the whole gunfight percentage. If it's stable on 50%, you could probably look for 50% gun duels, but you're really looking for something that's like 55%, 60%, and you want as many of those as possible.
Yeah, because you're going to be in tough positions on defense where your gunfight percentage in those are going to be like 40, 35, right? When you're just being bombarded and you've got breached, stunned and all that stuff. So you want to find your own duels that are pushing that number up. As we're talking about this, I was just thinking that, because we've talked about this before, that like the sentinel role is one of the roles where like your aim is really, really important. And, it's interesting that at the pro ranks, some of the cleanest aim is with sentinels, with Wes and Alphayer. And I think it's interesting, and I guess even Leaf, right? But it's interesting that in solo queue or in ranked, it tends to be the players that don't want to take gunfights that play sentinel. And therefore they're almost like they take this passive version of the game and their hope that aligns with their kind of play style, but their aim potential or their willingness to take fights is really low. And so like they're actually kind of like playing the role really suboptimally.
Man, that's such like a good thing to point out, because you're right, that dynamic does really exist in the game. And I don't really know why that is. Like, I could make some assumptions, but it is a shame, because I would imagine if I were to say throw a duelist player that's been playing duelist and they've been immortal forever, throw them on sentinel, there would probably be a better sentinel player than someone that's been maining sentinel that is also an immortal, right? And it's likely due to just purely the mechanic side of things and how willing they are to look for a duel. Whereas like if you do it in reverse, it's probably not true. So there is a big thing there, I think, that people shouldn't be scared of gun duels. And you have to kind of like build some type of blind confidence, in taking gun duels and like exposure stuff. I don't know why when you were talking about it, something that came to mind is like Kobe Bryant. Like sometimes I'll be like watching some of his motivational videos and like his interviews. But I don't know if the stat is true, but basically like he shoots a lot of shots, even if they're missed shots. And the vibe that I got from that was that he's looking for quantity rather than necessarily quality, because he wants to be in the control of the match, compared to like, people like call him a ball hog or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't play basketball, so I don't know too much about it. Maybe you can expand on that. But in a way, like I would rather you, like speaking to our viewers, look for gun duels and then try to figure out how to make them higher conversion, rather than being, say, the player that, hey, I can flash for you, maybe I can flash for myself, and there's a player with you. So the most common example I can see on this is like Omen on A main Ascent. Typically people one-way A main and then throw the blind from tree, which is useful because that blind is in a straight line and it can help set up your duelist. But when I like to play Omen, I don't blind from there. I like to blind from A main right next to my jet so that I can also swing. And I guess like that's kind of what I want to encourage people to go for.
Yeah, I think taking those things within your own hands makes sense. I think what you're talking about with Kobe, so I think there's a real beneficial aspect to that, which is just the mental resilience. Like you believe in your capability. So like someone like Steph Curry, who arguably might be the best shooter to ever play, he shoots over 40% from three, which is a ludicrous number. And the thing with Steph is that he's such a good shooter that even when he has a bad first two quarters, he's still taking his shots because he believes that it will fall. And I think when you are playing Valorant and you aren't playing well in the first half, I think it's like an enormous skill to continue to be able to believe in yourself in the second half. All that being said, Kobe in his last few years was not very efficient. Like he was taking a lot of shots and he wasn't very good. And maybe there's Kobe lovers out there. I was never a big Kobe fan, but like in this last couple of years, he was actively a negative aspect of the team because he was taking so many shots. But going back to that Sentinel idea and your willingness to take gunfights, I really think the difference between like putting a sentinel, like a sentinel main versus like a duelist main on sentinel is there's, I think, like a feeling of like, do you want to swing off your utility, or are you hoping they never touch your utility? Because I'm thinking most sentinel players are kind of hoping that turret never spots a player.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think Alfier is like, he's thirsty. Like he's hoping someone swings. He's hoping that turret pings. He's hoping he can, catch someone trying to, shoot the alarm bot.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And it's like that, like you said, thirsty is a good way to frame it. I had another question, I guess, and maybe this will kind of make sense based on how you're feeling on the day. That's kind of my perspective on it. But how much should you optimize? Like, when is it too much that you're optimizing for yourself, and when is it too much that you're optimizing for your team? Like, for example, with our individual factors, how
Yeah.
far can you go before you're kind of diminishing returns?
I think, I think so physical, I think that's, are you doing some amount of exercise? Are you eating okay? Are you drinking enough water? I don't think you can go too far on that. I think that's more of a personal decision. Like, do you want to strive to be, there's probably a maximal amount that's going to help you, right? Like, I don't think Sebum is going to be any better at Valorant than you are, even though he's jacked. I mean, I think he's also taking other supplements and maybe legal and illegal things. Um, but I think there's probably an upper limit for that. I don't. There's probably no upper limit to your mental, like how much you want to work on that in terms of meditation or other things. I think we've already talked about that. There probably is an upper limit on how much you're going to work on aim,
Mm-hmm.
because aim trainers only translate so much to the game. And then gunfight hygiene, I think there's probably going to be upper limit on that, because that's going to be probably restrained by both your aim, your utility, and your positioning. Um, but I think in general, at a really high level, I was kind of thinking through this as you were talking too. We talked about these guys a lot, Coach Curtis and Coach Nathan. They talk about how a lot of their clients in League of Legends, they try to play this like really supportive, like like LCS, LEC style of game. And they're like, up until you're a challenger, we'd rather you just focus on being like a really good individual player than trying to like coordinate team fights. And I think like, I feel probably I'd like your opinion on this. I feel like it's probably similar in Valorant. Like, until you're maybe like high immortal, low radiant, I think you should just be focusing more on the things that you can control. And I mean, I think it's helpful to throw out strats and align the team, but I don't think it makes sense to be a purely supportive player. Like, it makes sense when Ethan is flashing for Demon 1,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because he knows who. I saw the reports that supposedly it was Ethan that benched Demon 1. But anyways, like, I think like he knows he's flashing for, right? I think if you're flashing for Aspas, you're like, I'm down with that, right? But I think in ranked, you don't want to be doing that as much, because you don't know who your teammate's going to be, unless you are playing with a friend that's a crack duelist. I don't think maybe that's the best way of approaching your rank climb. I don't know. What do you think, Adam?
I think that is accurate. I would bias towards taking like this kind of goes back with like, taking as many gun deals as possible. But yeah, I mean, if I'm playing an initiator, I'd rather you be in the lens of like a battle initiator rather than like a supporting initiator. I think that's true really for any role. When I played controller, for example, I played a pretty hyper aggressive controller. Like, I rarely played retake. I would play for sight holds. Um, I would fast rotate even, which is typically not what controllers do. They should be playing anchor.
Yeah.
But that's kind of like the play style I adopted because I came from duelist role, and I feel like that's, in my opinion, that's how ranked should be played. So
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, I do agree with it.
So we were talking about this like idea of like battle initiators, Adam. And I'm just thinking that in general, you kind of would rather, if you're playing to improve, if you're playing to try to climb rank, I think you generally want to be aggressively biased in every role, whether that's sentinel, initiator, controller, or duelist. I was just watching some VODs the other day for Haven, to just see where the fate eyes are and all that stuff. And I was watching Asuna, and he was he was on CT or defense, and he was peeking out of a garage, and he was going to throw an eye in the corner to kind of like get people to turn and then swing off of it. And I think his goal is probably to take one duel and then just dip. And I think most players are not thinking that. They're like, oh, I'll just, I'll eye for info and all that stuff. And I think that's just generally like, oh, like how can I take a fight with this? And I think if most players I think most players are not thinking about how can I take a fight with this. I think on defense, most players are like, oh, how can I delay or execute with this? And I think that that's a fundamental like flip in mindset, right? Like I think doing the how do I take a fight with this is going to be the one way that you're going to be supporting your rank climb more in the long run than almost anything else.
I completely agree with this. I think this is kind of like we get into the factors that are like partially in your control, right? The util, the timing, the positioning, like all of that stuff is partially in your control here, and like the way you use your util is something that directly impacts your gunfight, but only in those situations that you use it to impact your gunfights, right? Because like a lot of times with initiated players, like you said, they use their dart or their eye for info, and they don't really take a deal with it. And maybe we can kind of get briefly make a little bit of how to increase your gunfight percentage with each role. But to kind of preface, or like for the way like initiators would do it, is instead of on defense, instead of darting every single round for info, right? That's a 40-second cooldown. That's going to take a while. You want to kind of hold it a little bit, and if they're fast rushing you, you want to use the dart to counter their push, right? So not delaying, but to counter their push. So when the jet dashes out, then you throw the dart up, and now the jet has to refresh the smoke, and the players in main can't come out, and then you can go for spam kills, right? If we hop over to, say, another role, like if I'm thinking controller, I don't want to use my smoke and my Omen Blind or my Viper Molly or my Brim Molly to delay. I'm smoking when I see their smoke and slightly timing my flash when they're about to come out, or like when they are already coming out, because I'm looking for the kills. I don't want to immediately smoke when I see like any set of noise and immediately flash when I hear anything and be like, hey, don't come here. I'm scared of you. Don't come here, please. Right? Like that's like your one option in every 4 rounds or so to actually get impact on a sight hold as a controller, and you want to be looking for that fight. And essentially, like, think about it as a trap, right? I think like with support agents in particular, but on defense in particular, thinking about your util as like activating a trap rather than like closing a door on someone, I think helps a lot. And then like quickly going into Sentinel, like how can you be increasing your gunfight percentage as a Sentinel? The main ones would actually be not playing on your setup. You're actually looking to play next to someone and kind of baiting them. But it's a little bit like you there are ways to play aggressive. Like, you could put the aggro turret on B main on Ascent for Killjoy and fight off of that and things like that. But generally what I've noticed, the best way to increase your gunfight percentage isn't actually through the util for Sentinel players, is actually through your positioning. So there's this concept that I like to call gamble setups, where if you're playing Cypher or Killjoy, you're putting all of your util on one site, and then you're just fingers crossed they come to my site, right? I think that doesn't give you high gunfight percentage relative to your gunfight numbers. The better way to play ranked, in my opinion, is spread your util a little bit, and then you're looking to get good gunfights via your positioning by being on the map rather than just being stuck to one side. So it's a little bit paradoxical, I think, for Sentinels, but it goes back to that, like, I'm looking for a duel as a Sentinel rather than hoping they come to me. And then Duelist, the main way to increase your gunfight percentage, if you're playing an off-angle agent, of course, is to go off-angle and go wide. And if you're playing a flash Duelist agent or like a util Duelist agent, let's say like a Raze or a Phoenix or a Yoru, you want to think more about the traps, right? Like nade, swing, flash, swing. Or if you're playing attack, you might wait for your teammates' util timing and combo it with yours to layer that util to increase your gunfights there. But yeah, I just wanted to quickly go into that. Hopefully that made sense.
I think if I were to try to distill that down, what I'm hearing is when you're using your util, like the frame or the lens to think of it is, how do I get one kill through this? And instead of how do I delay?
Right.
Cool. Well, is there anything else that we didn't cover that you think we should cover?
Just because we think about gunfights in Valorant, you always think about like the basics, right? Crosshair placement, peeking, how to hold angles and stuff like that. And I mean, all of that stuff is important, but I think like if someone wants to be hyper fixated on something, look at how you are holding your crosshair. Like, how are you anticipating the fight? I feel like that comes before the crosshair placement, and that comes before the peeking, right? Like, you have to know what angle you're actually looking for and what fight you're looking for before you can kind of know what's going on. So, another way to frame this is like, what are good spots and what are good angles for you, and really get used to those, because I think one thing that I guess we didn't talk about is like comfort in this gunfight percentage reps, right? Like if I think randomly Haven the mid window swing, right? I don't really get that many reps on that on attack, so I'm probably not going to win that duel even if I have all the other factors dialed in. But if I'm on defense and I'm holding window and I'm on top B, I'm going to win that fight a lot because I tend to take that fight a lot. And, you know, of course, there's a bunch of other factors into it. So comfort / reps and anticipation of the gun duel, I think, can't be overstated.
Well, with that, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. We'd love to hear your comments and your thoughts. And we really appreciate you tuning in. Have a great week, everyone.
Gunfight theory.